Hi, welcome to Gospel with Greg. And in the video today, I have a very special guest, my friend, author, and speaker, Abdu Murray with Embrace the Truth. It's great to have you on, Abdu.
Gregory, it's great to be with you, man. Thanks for having me on, man.
Oh, you bet. I've been really looking forward to this. And in this video, we're going to address various objections that I've heard to the Christian faith. I do a lot of apologetic stuff on my channel, and of course, I know you, Abdu, are very seasoned with that. And so a lot of these are comments or messages that I've gotten on my channel or social media, and some of them are questions and objections I've heard from several people. So these are kind of a collective question or objection, and so we're going to be responding to these. So the first one we're going to look at is the objection that health benefits behind the food laws in the Old Testament are common sense and don't require scientific knowledge to know. And so that kind of is a jab at when apologists might talk about scientific accuracy of the Bible, a skeptic might say, oh, that's no big deal. That's common knowledge. And so what are your thoughts on that, Abdu?
Well, a couple of things is that if it were the case, and sometimes I think apologists can get a little aggressive, not in terms of like their attitudes towards people, but they can get a little exuberant is probably the better word about certain things in the Bible and saying, well, that is sort of a scientific fact or a scientific fact that people then couldn't have known, and therefore, because that thing happened and the Bible prescribed that it should happen that way, that somehow that is a miraculous thing. And the Bible does have those, of course, but I think what the exuberance happens is that when we look at the dietary restrictions in the Old Testament, and we try to say, well, look, the don't eat pork stuff, for example, seems arbitrary. Like, really, why that, and not shellfish, and don't eat cheese and meat at the same time, and all that kind of thing. And so it seems arbitrary, and the skeptic might say, look, it looks arbitrary, that these laws aren't really from God. They're from a bunch of people who made up a bunch of stuff and needed to baptize their weirdness with God talk. And of course, the response from the apologist is, well, we see health benefits from this kind of a dietary restriction, and therefore, and they couldn't have known it back then, so it must be from God. So the skeptic responds and says, well, even if that were true, it's common sense. And you don't need divine intervention to tell you that that is the way you should eat. A couple of things about that. One, I'm not sure it actually is common sense in some ways, because the restrictions are sort of, in some senses, they seem like arbitrary, not arbitrary, I shouldn't say that. They seem to have no reference to the health benefit themselves. They're neutral on the subject, in other words, like mixing crops and rotating your crops and these kind of things. They don't seem to, they might be good for crop production, generally speaking, but people kind of knew that back then, and that's probably true. But there's no overt, obvious health benefit other than that the crops produce better than they otherwise would have. Why I say all that is because sometimes in our zealousness to prove the Bible, we'll go to an argument that we think somehow proves it with scientific fervor, when in fact that isn't the point. The dietary restrictions in the Bible are not really about the health benefits per se. There may be ancillary health benefits, and I haven't done a deep enough dive to know that that's true or not. Really, what's going on with the dietary restrictions is there is an effort within the ceremonial law and the covenantal law with Israel as a covenant people, as opposed to like just the straight up moral law that applies to everybody. There's an effort to for God to make sure that the people of Israel remain separate in their culture from the pagan cultures around them. So certain things were considered unclean because other cultures had indulged in those kinds of eating of those kinds of animals or those kinds of foods. So really the issue isn't health. The issue is spiritual health. Do you maintain your separateness from the people that you're around, so that you, as a nation of Israel, through whom the Messiah has been promised, will maintain and retain your separateness, not in that you don't interact with other cultures, but that you don't allow the bad influences from those cultures into your own culture and pollute it and pervert it, and thereby essentially prevent or thwart this idea of the Messiah coming through the people of Israel to the rest of the world. So it's a way to keep Israel separate from the rest of the world. And one of the ways you do that is through dietary restriction. Food happens to be a way in which people commune and they welcome people in. They have ceremonies. They have rites of passage that are centered around food, certain kind of banquets, even interactions between the cultures are centered around banquets. And if you have a distinctive, you tend to stay that way. It tends to be the kind of thing that sticks in your mind as well. So it's got spiritual and cultural significance to it. The health benefits, I'm not sure that's the point of that the Bible's trying to make with regard to those restrictions. So what that means essentially is, if the Bible is not trying to make a point about the health benefits, then when the skeptic says those were common sense, and you didn't need God to tell you that, it doesn't debunk the Bible in any way, shape, or form, because the Bible wasn't making that claim in the first place. Now, having said that, if it is the case that the health benefits are there, well, then that's terrific. Those dietary restrictions and those dietary laws actually have the added benefit of having a physical benefit, in which case now when you take the cumulative case of the cultural and spiritual benefit attached to the physical benefit, well, now you got a cumulative case for the wisdom behind those laws. But of course, we know from the New Testament that when Peter sees the vision, when he's in Joppa, he sees the vision of the sheet rolled down and the various animals that were once considered unclean. Peter is now commanded to rise, kill, and eat. My guess is that God is not saying, here, eat all these filthy things that are going to pollute your body and make sure you have debilitating sickness. If that were the case, then we would say that kind of a God, that is incredibly arbitrary. So if there were health benefits to it, and then God changes his mind, so to speak, then he seems to suggest that the health benefits aren't worth it anymore. But if there were no supernatural health benefits that came from this kind of a diet, then changing the dietary laws wouldn't have an effect in the first place. So we do see a change, and that should cause us at least to pause about whether or not we put too much stock in the scientifically unknowable health benefits of the dietary laws in the Old Testament.
And I think a good point that kind of segues from what you said is we shouldn't put too much weight on this issue of it's like Christianity hinges on, could Moses have known if you can eat undercooked pork or not? Right. And so I think that is important. And I think that from a historian standpoint too, of when we talk about this issue of scientific knowledge in the Bible, whether it's this or, something else like creation, and how that compares to modern discoveries, is I think historical context is important too. Mm-hmm. And I think that, again, we can debate what could they have known and everything, but I think that that's something a lot of people leave out in these discussions, is we are in a 21st century context where a lot of things have been discovered and have been established facts of how science works that they didn't know back then. And so I think that, again, we can, kind of debate these things and all that, but I think that that's something that a lot of people don't consider.
Yeah. And I think that you're right about that. And one of the things that we want to do is we don't want to make the Bible into a scientific treatise when it isn't intended to be that, but we also don't want to discount when the Bible does make claims about the way the natural world works, and it comports with modern science. The trick here also, Gregory, is that science is held provisionally. Its conclusions tend to be held provisionally. I mean, certain things are established, quote unquote, scientific fact, like gravity and the way gravity works, and Newton's laws of motion, and various things with various, sort of modifications to them. But there are certain things that we don't challenge anymore. Other things we challenge all the time. And sometimes we have things that have been, sacred cows, pun intended, of the scientific world that we suddenly challenge and think maybe we should look at that again. The point of me saying all that is that if we hinge the Bible's credibility on science, as if that's the main thing that will prove the Bible's authenticity, when the science changes, now what are we left with? Now, the good news is that the Bible doesn't go into a ton of detail on various scientific things, or every scientific thing, but it does go into enough detail about creation where we can see that the universe does seem, in fact, to be designed for the purpose of life, not only being created, but perpetuating. So the Bible does carry some scientific heft to it, but we have to be careful not to go too far.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And so the next question / objection that I had was, it's kind of a classic one. Why does God allow tragic things to happen? And the specific example I was given was, why does God allow things like children having cancer happen?
Yeah. Yeah, and this is likely the thorniest question and objection you can raise. But, there's this brilliant interview with John Lennox and Alex O'Connor, the cosmic skeptic, and John Lennox does a brilliant job of saying, Alex, this question isn't just for me; it's for you too. There's the mystery of suffering and the mystery of evil, because you have to have two competing questions. If there is no God, if we're here by accident, then how do we explain the mystery of our inherent understanding that children having cancer is bad? If you could prevent it, then you should prevent it. And how do we understand where the should comes from? If it's just merely human opinion, well, that is the definition of subjective. We are the subject of that suffering, and therefore our opinion about it is the only opinion that there could be if there is no God, which makes it a subjective issue, not an objective issue. But we recognize that it seems to be objectively true that if you can stop suffering without a greater cause for allowing it to continue, then you should. So the skeptic has the exact same burden, is to understand the mystery of how their worldview can also make sense of suffering and evil as objectively bad things. The Christian has, and every theist, whether they're a Christian or otherwise, has the burden of explaining the mystery of how a God who is all good, all powerful, and all-knowing could allow suffering to exist, including amongst the innocents, in a way that doesn't involve free will, like the killing of people or the robbing or pillaging of certain things, but like natural disasters or illnesses and these kind of things, where there seems to be no moral agent involved. So you see what's going on here is that you have the skeptic who has a mystery to have to solve, and the Christian who has a mystery to have to solve. At some point, neither one of them, neither the Christian nor the skeptic, will be able to say, I know why God allowed this particular instance of suffering to happen. Or if you don't believe in God, I know why this fits into the grand scheme of some kind of moral framework I have. If you're an atheist, you won't know why any one particular instance of suffering happens. But on an atheistic framework, you'll never know, because the reality is you have to create a fiction of objective moral values and duties out of the subjective experience of suffering. You've got to create a fiction to make sense of it. The Christian doesn't have to do that. The Christian can say objective moral values and duties exist because there is a God who is the source of objective values and who is also the aim of our sense of duty, objective moral duty. So the question is always a moral question. How could God allow this? It's a moral question. And if there is no God, then morality is simply subjective, and therefore the question itself explodes or implodes because it has no objective moral basis upon which to assert its objective moral claim. But God actually makes sense of the question itself. It is, I believe, the theist who believes in God who has the philosophical grounding to say, suffering is objectively wrong. We experience that suffering, and so now we have to ask, what is this all about? Is there a purpose behind this? And I would say not only does the theist have the ability to make that claim, but the Christian theist has more than just the ability to say objective moral values and duties exist given God's existence. Now we can ask, as a Christian, has God done something with suffering, generally speaking? Because we'll never know. Well, I just shouldn't say we never know. We're very unlikely to know why people get sick. And I don't mean generally speaking because of the fall, of course, but why a certain person gets sick and why a certain person gets healed and why another person doesn't. We're not privy to that, and we'll never know, likely, on this side of heaven. But I can know what God would do with suffering or will do with suffering because of what God did do with suffering. And the historic Christian faith rests on the cross, which is God himself, the Father forsaking the Son, the Son feeling the forsakenness of the Father, and the Holy Spirit quickening to our minds this reality. We see suffering happening unjustly at the cross, and then of course it is overcome at the resurrection, which means that I have a basis as a Christian to recognize that suffering has a moral component. If it didn't, then Jesus wouldn't die for our sin, which is a moral issue. And it has the moral component in the overcoming of it, which is the resurrection, which leads to our salvation, which is a moral good. So God overcomes moral evil, and it results in moral good. The skeptic has no answer for this because it's all arbitrary and meaningless, and it's only what you give it. Whereas the Christian can say, I don't have a theory. I don't have a mere philosophy, although that's pretty good all by itself. I have the actual history of the cross and resurrection. So God can allow suffering and evil, and I can trust him with what he will do with it because I already know, as a matter of history, what he has done with it. Whereas the skeptic has no basis upon which to make any such claim. It's all make of it what you will. And in the end, that seems bereft of real hope.
And I think it's really powerful that, God himself through Christ used suffering, and that actually kind of goes into the next question I was going to bring up, which was, if God is good, how can he use evil or use suffering and everything? And so those two kind of go together. And, like you said, we ultimately see that with the cross. And I think that's really powerful because, that's not necessarily universal among all faiths and worldviews in the way that we see it in the Christian faith of God himself being willing to do that. Yeah. And I think something else that is important for us to keep in mind, and I think you've mentioned this in some of your videos, is that, these things are tough. I know people that, they've lost their children to different illnesses and everything. And, that is very tough. And, we, like you said, may never know the reasons, but, sometimes we somewhat understandably will kind of jump to this conclusion of, there could be no good reason for this and everything. And some people will, use that as a reason to not believe in God. So, people will kind of use that mentality of like, I know there could be no good reason for it. And so I'm going to discredit a being who is all knowing. Yeah. So
that goes right back to that issue of divine knowledge, is that, as you pointed out, the only way you could say there is an inherent contradiction, or even a probabilistic issue, that given this much evil, it's highly unlikely that God exists. You have to know the beginning from the end. You have to know with all certainty that no greater good can come from a certain instance of suffering, no matter how great that suffering might be. You'd have to have infinite knowledge of not only the actual future, but all possible futures. And you're using your infinite knowledge of the possible and actual futures to disprove the existence of a being who would have infinite knowledge of the actual and possible futures. So when you claim there is no way, or it's so highly unlikely, well, then you claim to have all the background information necessary to make that conditional probability statement. And it just simply is untenable for you to say that you can have that. No one can really say that. Does that mean that the struggle isn't real and that people are unreasonable for rejecting God, or at least questioning his existence in light of unspeakable suffering? No, we don't mean that. We don't mean that, survivors of concentration camps and people who have been tortured for weeks or even years on end, or those who suffered losses because of tsunamis, don't have a right to say, I don't get it, God. We don't say that. In fact, I'll go one step further and say the book of Job actually ends with something that I think is a mix of two things. One, Job asks all these questions of God, and God comes to Job out of the whirlwind, and he says, gird yourself like a man, because I'm going to ask you some questions now. Now, part of that is the brace yourself. Who do you think you are? There's a little bit of that in there, of course. But a part of it is also Job, you know a bunch of stuff about me. You know that I'm the one who set the stars where they belong. I'm the one who set the world spinning on its axis. I'm the one who said the waters can go no further than this. I'm the one who tames the Leviathan. I'm the one who does all these things. And you weren't there for any of it. You know I did those things, but you weren't there for any of it. You trust me with the creation of the world. And what I'm asking you, Job, is to trust me with this too. So that is the Christian humility that exists there, is that you don't know enough things to say God couldn't possibly. And I think it's funny because sometimes there are skeptics. Michael Shermer's done this in the past, and others who have said that they find Christianity arrogant because it claims to have all the answers. And the skeptic is the one who's humble because he holds things provisionally, except the fact that God can't possibly exist because of suffering and evil. In which case, suddenly, we're very, very sure of ourselves. The Christian actually remains humble because he or she is, I don't understand this, but I can trust because of what God himself has done through his own suffering. So you're quite right that we have to make sure we temper our answers, whether skeptical or Christian, with some humility.
Yeah, definitely. And with this question in particular, I can relate to it a lot. Regular viewers in my channel will know, and I think I shared a little with you, Abdu, but my testimony kind of ties into this because I was dead for 6 minutes when I was born, and it didn't look like they would get me back. They tried CPR and everything, and even after that, they told my parents, they said he was without oxygen too long. He's got too much brain damage.
Wow.
And I wouldn't survive lifelong seizures, would never communicate or comprehend anything. And that was very tough for my parents. I mean, they were believers themselves, but, they'll admit they were quite shaken up by that. And, and, I was their only child. They had no children before or after me. And so that was tough for them to kind of look at it of, God gave us a son and it looks like he's either not going to survive. And they told my mom she couldn't have any more kids after me. She had sustained a lot of injuries. So it looked to them like, our one shot of being parents is gone now, or, our son will at least have no quality of life.
Wow.
So, that's something that my parents could, relate to a lot. And it's something that, of course, I can myself too. And it's one of those things of course, I can't speak to everybody's experience of every problem anybody could have. And I'm not trying to, but, for me, something I have found in my case, because I don't have any seizures, I have no brain damage. And I was able to, I'm a minister now and was able to go to college and everything. Yeah. And in my case, in terms of God using, allowing something very unfortunate to happen for a greater purpose, I find I have a lot more appreciation for what I do have now. And, there are sometimes with I get upset about trivial things like a lot of people do at times.
Everybody does.
But, I find that that's a check for me, because I'll think about, I'm so upset about this or that thing, or, I have, 10,000 dreams and I don't have them all right now, but I'll get, a picture of me when I was an hour old with life support wires and all that stuff. And I'll think about that. And it just gives me so much appreciation. There was one day where I'm working on my PhD dissertation right now. And there was one day where, and I'm also writing a book about my testimony, and it has that picture of me on the cover when I was a baby.
Wow.
And there was one day where I was working on my book and my dissertation, and I happened to look at that picture of me when I was a baby and was really thinking about that, of what God had done for me. And then I looked over at my dissertation and kind of, could see them side by side. And I literally just started crying in my room.
That's amazing.
So, yeah. So, tough things can be tough at the time, but it's like, it's like when you get through it, and again, people are going to have different experiences with that. It's like it can give you so much of a greater appreciation you wouldn't have had before.
Indeed. Yeah, absolutely. That's wow. I knew some of that story. That is just such a powerful story, especially to hear directly from you.
Yeah. I love telling people.
I'm sure you do. I would.
So our next kind of objection I wanted to get to is there are no contemporary sources of Jesus. And so that's kind of a jab at, kind of the historical case for Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So a couple of things on that. And it's, I think the reason, I'm a big fan of making an argument as hard as possible to overcome. I'm a big fan of steel manning an argument, not straw manning an argument. So what I want to make it as an assumption is when someone says there are no contemporaneous documents or records of Jesus, they're discounting the Gospels, because because of course they were biased and whatever it might be, and with the Gospels and Acts and any early letters of Paul, etc., might be these biased accounts of things. And of course you have First and Second Peter, which though largely theological and Christian living in their import, also have some historical facts in there. They're biased, so we don't have any non-biased contemporaneous sources. Well, first of all, I don't know in the history of the world any completely non-biased source about anybody with anything. So you're never going to have that. But second is, we're too quick to dismiss the Gospels as contemporaneous because they were written decades after Jesus's death and supposed resurrection. But they weren't written that far afterwards. In fact, a lot of it, there's great reasons to believe that the Gospel of Mark was written well within a decade, maybe 2 decades after the events that the Gospel itself records. And the oral tradition that goes into Mark and into the other Gospels, Matthew and Luke, in terms of the synoptics, and even into John to some degree, was circulating well before those things were actually written down. And we're finding more and more information, more and more manuscript evidence about how old and how lasting papyrus actually can be, that suggests that these records, when they were written down, were widespread and were sustainable, so that the manuscripts, quite literally, physically, not just the families of manuscripts, but the manuscripts themselves, were stable. They weren't deteriorating and crumbling in front of everybody, and we had to hurry up and write them down before they are lost to memory. So here's my timeline on the Gospels. So it's widely recognized that Luke and Acts are first part, second part. One's a sequel. Acts is a sequel to the book of Luke, and Luke, of course, records lots of things, and the book of Acts records lots of historical things, including Paul's missionary journeys, and it talks about shipwrecks and beatings and guys falling asleep while Paul is preaching and falling out of windows, and the detail level is pretty high, especially about Paul and his suffering. One thing it doesn't include is Paul's death. It just doesn't include Paul's death, which is, I would say, fairly agreed upon within the scholarly community, happened around 64 AD. when he was beheaded by the Emperor of Rome. So if I were to write a history of the city of New York, or I were to find one, I should say, and there's no date on it, and I just find it, and it doesn't include 9/11. The thing that you would reasonably conclude is that it was written before 9/11, because this is one of, if not the most important event that ever happened in the history of the city of New York. To not include it would be a gross malpractice of history. So you have to assume that the person wrote it before 9/11 happened. So you date it to no later than September 10th, 2001. Well, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem is a cataclysmic event in the eyes of Jews. Paul's death is a very important fact in his own life, of course. The end of your life is usually as important as the birth narrative as well. So Luke, who records all of these things about Paul's life, doesn't record Paul's death. It's not in there. When would you conclude that the book of Acts, therefore, was written? Probably no later than late 63, maybe sometime in 64 AD, right before Paul died. Let's give it as late as possible. Let's say 64 is the latest you would give to the book of Acts. It's a sequel to Luke's gospel, which means that Luke's gospel was probably written in the 50s. And now we're talking about 17 years, 15 to 17, maybe 18 years after Jesus' death, which is not that long ago. I mean, 9/11 happened. It's as you and I are sitting here talking, it's July of 2025. 9/11 happened 24 years ago, and I remember it extremely vividly. I remember a lot of things about it extremely vividly because it's the kind of thing that sticks. Well, a guy dying and rising from the dead probably sticks in your mind too. So 18 years, not that long of a time. And that's with the Gospel of Luke. It's not everybody, but most people will agree that that Matthew was probably contemporaneous with Luke to some degree, but Mark was written before that. Some have Matthean priority and say that Matthew was first, and that's fine, because in any event, what you have is a sequence that if Luke was written in the 50s, late 50s, then Matthew and Mark would be written before that. Mark most likely well before that, which now puts it in the early 50s, maybe even in the 40s. Now you're talking within a decade or a little bit more than a decade after Jesus's death under Pontius Pilate. So you have a really early dating compared to almost every other ancient manuscript in the world. You have a very early dating given the timeline for the Gospels for the life of Jesus, what he said and what he did. Couple that with the fact that you have someone like Richard Bauckham, for example, and Jesus and Eyewitnesses, for various reasons, makes a compelling case, I think, for the Gospel of Mark to actually be the eyewitness account, largely, not entirely, but largely of the Apostle Peter. So you have a contemporaneous eyewitness account of the things that happen in the Gospel of Mark because it's based on Peter. Then you have little indications throughout the Gospels, Matthew and Luke, about eyewitness testimony, given the names that appear and the names that don't appear in the New Testament as well. So you have a million reasons to believe that the Gospel accounts themselves are contemporaneous records of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. Couple that, of course, with Paul's letters afterwards and the way in which the disciples affirmed Paul as a disciple. And not only did the disciples affirm Paul, as Paul himself records, but the disciples of Peter and James, and Peter and John, Clement and Polycarp, actually say that Paul, who was a contemporary of our teachers, preached the same exact gospel that our teachers preached, which included the historical fact of the resurrection. So you have Paul saying it, then you have non-apostolic sources also corroborating it. So you've got a lot of reasons to believe that this is early and reliable. And then you couple that, or you actually triple now, that with ancient Roman and Jewish sources like Cornelius Tacitus, who wrote a few decades, of course, after Jesus' death, but was recording the history as he saw it in the history of Rome. You have Josephus, who was recording something similar, and you have some issues with the Josephus texts, but largely scholars will agree that the idea that Jesus was a man who was crucified under Pontius Pilate, for example, is a preserved part of the record. You put all that together and you have wonderful contemporaneous documents. Tacitus was a Roman historian, not a fan of Christianity. Josephus was a Jewish historian writing for the Romans, not a big fan of Christianity. And then you have, an additional cascade of people from Pliny and Suetonius and various other, I'm forgetting all the names of the various people, Mara Bar Serapion, and if later on, and you keep going later and later, and you had this wonderful chain of succession. J. Warner Wallace, the famed cold case homicide detective, once atheist turned Christian, talks about chain of custody with regard to the information about Jesus. And he says, look, we have this unbroken chain of custody of this tradition that goes from Jesus to the disciples of the disciples and the church fathers, and it keeps going on and on and on. And it's unbroken, and no one challenges the narrative within the pale of orthodoxy. You do get some, Gnostic writings and that kind of stuff, but for the most part, that's really, really late, and it doesn't compare to the earliest stuff. So, plus, that is so much contemporary documents compared to who Jesus actually was in a non-Christian objective figure of history kind of a setting. Here you have this peasant Jew from a peasant town that no one really regarded as important in a outpost of the Roman Empire that no one really regarded as important. In fact, it was a punishment to be placed in authority there by the Romans. Like you were on your way out, as it were, or needed to work your way up, depending on how you look at it. So you wouldn't expect a ton of documents about Jesus. And yet this is what we have. We have a ton compared to what we should expect. We should expect less, not what we have. So what we have is actually quite great.
Something I think that is very, very interesting and kind of historically compelling that goes off the last thing you mentioned about kind of it seemed like an insignificant place and, and everything like that of we should expect to see a far less sources is like from a historian standpoint, if you are studying a certain area or time period or whatever it is, and you find an unusually high density of sources about a certain person, you're not going to say, oh, well, I see something that looks like a contradiction to me, or, this looks like a bias, which, like you said, every source is going to have, is going to be subject to bias because we are. And, you're not just going to say, okay, I'm just throwing this all out.
Right.
And I think that's important too, because when you think about it, it's like, where would you draw the line with that? Some people can keep just saying, what do we have except for this? Well, this, well, what about except for that? And, you can just
keep moving the goalposts. I mean, you don't do that with the Titanic. I mean, the fact is we have most of our understanding of what happened in the Titanic is not due to the evidence of what's at the bottom of the ocean. It's due to the eyewitness accounts of the people who were there. Are you really going to say we can't trust those accounts because they were biased, because they were survivors and they were there? How about Holocaust survivors? Are we going to say we can't trust their accounts because they were there and they may have had an axe to grind? We would never do that there, yet we do that here. So I think you're hitting on it quite well. Is that you'd expect there to be great eyewitness testimony, and by the way, that testimony would probably lead to conversions because you saw the kind of thing that would lead you to want to convert in the first place.
Yeah, and something that actually kind of ties into when you're mentioning the Holocaust example, something that's sort of similar to that I studied personally was as an undergraduate, I did a semester research on Japanese American internment camps. And there are some written accounts of that of people who lived through it, of what that was like. And so my research focused on that, the conditions of the camps. And some of the sources I used naturally were the accounts of people who had been in them. And the professor overseeing my research, he didn't say, oh, no, Greg, don't look at that. That's bias.
Right.
He actually encouraged me. That's good. See what more you can find, that's a lot of information. And so I think that's important too. And, it kind of goes to show even more of like, we as people are biased, but in terms of how you do history, we don't just chuck out, a source because it's biased, so to speak. Because I mean, really, in a pure sense, you'd have to throw out everything on anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And we take the life of Julius Caesar. We take the life of lots of great figures, either based on autobiographies or biographies of people who were paid to do them. And they would have arguably more bias than the gospel writers because the gospel writers didn't get money, power, sex, or fame. in their immediate context from the thing that they were looking for. They got fame eventually because the message lasted, but they didn't get the other things people are typically motivated to lie about. Whereas, and it wasn't their job. They got the opposite of all those things. They were poor. They were constantly in physical danger. They were preaching chastity and moral living, sexually and otherwise. So the constant motivations for bias just didn't exist. In fact, they were demotivations in many ways. And yet here we have the records we're sitting with today.
Yep. Well, we are at about the end of our time. I want to thank you again for being on. Did you have any kind of final thoughts you wanted to share?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first, I just want to thank you for having me on. And I realize the time was short. We can only get to a few questions, and I'm sure there's many more on the list we could get to, and maybe we'll do it again sometime. Here's my final thought. My final thought is I have two. One, for the skeptic who's watching, what I hope you can do is listen through each answer specifically, but don't take my word for it. Go and look it up. Go and see if what I'm saying is true, or if what Greg is saying is true. Don't just buy it because we said so, and don't just deny it because we said it's true too. We have to ask ourselves, are we a skeptic or are we a cynic? A skeptic is somebody who won't believe until there's good enough reasons. A cynic is somebody who won't believe even when there is. We have to ask ourselves, which one are we? So that's for the audience. The second thing I'd say, though, is for you, Greg, is that you're doing a wonderful thing here by elucidating the truth through the digital means. This is the Romans road of today. This is the way in which the truth gets out there. There's so much truth to combat. And my encouragement to you is to keep doing it with integrity, keep doing it with that researcher's eye you already have, that scholarly eye you already have, and just keep up the good work, and grateful to call you brother.
I feel the same way, and thank you very much for that. And to the viewers, I'll put links to Abdu's website for his Embrace the Truth ministry and his social media pages. And I thank you all for watching. And until next time, God bless.